Thank you for joining us at 10. I'm Keith Garvin. Daniela is off tonight. New at 10 tonight, after several last-minute appeals, tonight the state of Texas carried out the execution of 61-year-old Garcia Glen White.
The suffering that the surviving family members have gone through is just unspeakable.
Garcia White is set to be executed in less than an hour. The Houston man was sentenced to death back in 1996 for the murders.
During his final statement, White told the families, "I apologize and I am sorry for all the pain I have caused."
December 2nd, 1989. A maintenance worker stands frozen in the doorway of apartment number 6. The smell hits him first. Then, the silence. The kind of silence that screams. Inside, 3 bodies. A mother and her twin daughters. Positioned like they're sleeping, but they've been dead for days. The man responsible? He wasn't a stranger who kicked down the door. He was someone they knew, someone they trusted, someone who sat on their couch, ate at their table, and smiled at those girls like family. His name was Garcia Glen White, and what you're about to hear is the true story of how one man's addiction and rage created a trail of bodies across Houston that went undetected for 6 years. How technology finally caught him, and how 35 years later the state of Texas would make him answer for every single life he took. Before we begin this journey into one of Houston's most haunting cases, hit that subscribe button. Because the details of this crime, the forensics, the confession, the decades-long wait for justice will stay with you long after this video ends. Houston, Texas, 1963. The year Garcia Glen White was born into a city that promised opportunity but delivered struggle. His childhood wasn't marked by privilege. It was marked by survival. Teachers at his elementary school described a boy who seemed present but distant, quiet, detached, like he was watching the world from behind glass. As Garcia grew older, that distance deepened into something darker. Jobs came and went. Paychecks never stretched far enough. And by his 20s, Houston's growing drug trade offered an escape that promised relief, but delivered only ruin. Crack cocaine didn't just take hold of Garcia Glen White, it consumed him entirely. By the late 1980s, White had become a ghost in Houston's underground, drifting from one abandoned apartment to another, chasing a high that faded faster every time. Police knew him as a petty user, not a violent man. But beneath the haze of addiction, something dangerous was taking root: paranoia, resentment, and a willingness to do whatever it took to keep the drugs coming. It was during this spiral that White met Bonita Edwards, 38 years old, a mother trying desperately to hold her family together while the world crumbled around her. Bonita had twin daughters, Annette and Bernette Edwards, both 16 years old, both full of dreams that didn't fit inside the small apartment they called home. These girls wanted out of the chaos, out of the endless stream of users drifting through their living room, out of the life that drugs had forced upon them. The apartment on Houston's northeast side had become a gathering spot, a place where people like Garcia Glen White could score, use, and disappear. Bonita struggled to control it. Her daughters resented every person who walked through that door. When White started visiting more frequently, no one saw him as a threat, just another lost soul. Another user passing through, another face in the rotation. But White's presence became constant. His conversations with Bonita grew tense, arguments over money, over drugs, over loyalty. The girls especially resented him. This man who seemed to be always there, always needing something, always taking. What no one understood then was that Garcia Glen White was reaching a breaking point. The drugs weren't working anymore. The paranoia was winning. And in his fractured mind, everyone around him was either an asset or an obstacle. The Edwards family was about to become obstacles. November 1989. The nights were getting colder, shorter, the kind of weather that makes people lock their doors early and stay inside. Inside apartment number 6, tension had been building for weeks. White's visits were becoming more erratic, more aggressive, more desperate. And then came the night of November 30th, 1989. A Thursday. The night everything changed. Stay with us, because what happened inside that apartment would take investigators 6 years to solve and another 29 years to bring to justice. November 30th, 1989. A Thursday night in northeast Houston. The kind of evening when the city winds down. Televisions flicker. Traffic fades. Most people settle in for the night, never imagining that just a few blocks away, a family's last moments are unfolding. Inside the apartment at 1447 Maple Drive, apartment number 6, Bonita Edwards was home with her daughters, Annette and Bernette, 16 years old. Girls who should have been worried about homework and boys and what to wear tomorrow. Instead, they were trapped in a home that had become a nightmare. According to later court transcripts and forensic analysis, Garcia Glen White arrived at the apartment sometime between 8 and 9 p.m. He wasn't forced in. Bonita knew him. She opened the door. What started as conversation quickly escalated. An argument. Words over money. Over drugs that had run out too soon. Over accusations about loyalty and respect. The exact words were never recorded. No witnesses survived to tell us. But we know how it ended. Investigators would later reconstruct this night frame by frame. Blood spatter analysis, autopsy results, DNA evidence, crime scene photography, digital forensic modeling, every piece of evidence told the same story. A story of methodical, deliberate violence. At some point, prosecutors estimated around 10 p.m. based on stomach contents and liver temperature, Garcia Glen White snapped. Bonita was attacked first. The forensic pathologist who performed her autopsy testified that she sustained multiple sharp force injuries, most to the upper body. Defensive wounds on her hands and forearms told investigators she tried to fight back. She tried to protect herself. A kitchen knife was later recovered at the scene. Blood analysis confirmed it was the murder weapon. It carried traces of Bonita's blood and fingerprints, both hers and White's. But here's what makes this crime so haunting. Bonita wasn't the only victim that night. After the initial assault, the apartment didn't go silent because 2 terrified 16-year-old girls had witnessed everything. Annette and Bernette tried to hide. Court transcripts describe how forensic analysts tracked the girls' movements through the apartment using blood evidence and disturbance patterns. One retreated toward the bedroom, the other toward the bathroom. White followed. The autopsy reports, entered into evidence during the trial, described the attacks as deliberate and sequential. Each victim suffered similar wounds, similar patterns. The medical examiner emphasized that each attack likely unfolded within minutes of the other. DNA evidence, later confirmed by FBI laboratory analysis, showed a clear genetic match between Garcia Glen White and one of the victims. Prosecutors used this evidence to demonstrate not just presence, but direct physical contact during the commission of these crimes. When investigators later reviewed the layout of the apartment, the physical evidence told a grim sequence. A broken lamp near the living room. Blood spatter on the wall indicating the initial attack location. A bloody handprint in the hallway, smeared, someone trying to get away. The bathroom door partly closed. Water still pooled near the tub's edge. Drag marks. The bedroom. Disturbance patterns in the bedding. More blood evidence. Digital forensic specialists later scanned every crime scene photograph, enhanced the details, built 3D models for court exhibits. What they created was a minute-by-minute reconstruction of horror. But here's what disturbs investigators even now. After the attacks, White didn't immediately flee. He stayed inside the apartment, moving between rooms, touching things, thinking, processing what he'd done. The television was still on when police arrived days later, its light casting shadows across the floor. Evidence suggests White remained in the apartment for at least 30 minutes after the last victim died, maybe longer. What was he doing during that time? What was going through his mind? We'll never fully know. When White finally left, he walked out the front door. And here's the detail that would eventually lead to the bodies being discovered. He left that door open, not wide open, just slightly ajar. Maybe 6 inches. Was it intentional? Did he want the bodies found quickly? Or was it simply the carelessness of a man in a drug-induced haze who'd just committed an unthinkable crime? For the next 2 days, December 1st and December 2nd, Apartment number 6 sat in silence. Bonita didn't show up for work. No one called her employer to explain. The girls didn't go to school. Teachers marked them absent. No one followed up. Mail piled up outside the door. The newspaper sat on the doorstep, uncollected. On December 2nd, 1989, Bonita's boyfriend became worried. He'd been trying to reach her for 2 days. No answer. No returned calls. Nothing. He went to the apartment, saw the door standing open, and asked the maintenance worker to check inside. The moment that door opened wider, the air changed. The maintenance worker, a man named Robert Torres, who'd worked at the complex for 15 years, later said the smell hit him immediately. Sweet, metallic, wrong. He stepped back, couldn't go further. Bonita's boyfriend called 911. The call came in at 11:47 a.m. on December 2nd, 1989. "There's something wrong," the boyfriend said. "The door's been open. I can smell... I think something's happened. I think they're dead." Houston police arrived within minutes. The first officers on scene later described the apartment as eerily intact. Nothing was stolen, no signs of ransacking, no forced entry, just silence. And 3 bodies. Bonita Edwards, 38 years old, Annette Edwards, 16 years old, Bernette Edwards, 16 years old, all gone. Investigators methodically documented every inch of that apartment. Photogrammetry scans captured the layout. DNA swabs were taken from towels, bedding, blankets, every surface that might hold evidence. In the coming months and years, those samples would undergo testing at the State Crime Lab. Later, they'd be verified by FBI mitochondrial DNA analysis. Multiple agencies, multiple confirmations, building a case that would eventually be unshakable. The autopsy results confirmed cause of death for each victim, established that the attacks were carried out with the same weapon. Medical examiners' reports noted injuries consistent with resistance and movement, evidence of struggle that spanned multiple rooms. For detectives standing in that apartment on December 2nd, 1989, one thing was immediately clear. This wasn't a stranger killing. This wasn't a random break-in gone wrong. Whoever did this had been let inside. The family knew them, trusted them. But who? Neighbors were questioned that night. Several mentioned Garcia Glen White, said they'd seen him around, described him as quiet, distant, never outwardly aggressive. Just another guy in the neighborhood living on the edge. None of them could have imagined his role in what had happened inside apartment 6. But investigators had no physical evidence linking him to the scene. Not yet. The fingerprints collected didn't match anyone in their database. The DNA profiles were partial. Technology in 1989 couldn't narrow them down enough to be useful. All they had was a horrific crime scene, 3 dead bodies, and no clear suspect. In the days that followed, local media covered the story extensively. Triple homicide in northeast Houston. Reporters called it one of the most disturbing crimes of the decade. But weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. The evidence was boxed, stored, the case went cold. Garcia Glen White disappeared back into Houston's streets, back into the drug trade, back into anonymity. He would remain free for 6 more years. Stay with us. Because in 1995, a completely different murder, in a completely different part of Houston, would finally bring Garcia Glen White's killing spree to an end. 1989 to 1995. 6 years during which the Edwards case sat in silence. Evidence boxes gathering dust in a Houston police storage facility. A case that haunted the detectives who'd worked it, but offered no new leads. No witnesses coming forward. No breakthrough. But Garcia Glen White wasn't silent during those 6 years. What investigators didn't know then, what they wouldn't learn until White's confession years later, was that the Edwards murders weren't his first killing, and they wouldn't be his last. White had been moving through Houston like a ghost, still using drugs, still surviving on the margins, still capable of horrific violence when circumstances aligned. Somewhere during this period, the exact date remains unclear, White killed again. Her name was Greta Williams, another Houston resident, another life cut short, Another family left with questions that wouldn't be answered for years. Details about Greta Williams' death are scarce. White confessed to her murder, but investigators struggled to find comprehensive records. Another case that hadn't been properly connected. Another victim who might have been classified as natural causes or accidental death. The pattern was emerging, even if no one could see it yet. Garcia Glen White spent these 6 years doing exactly what he'd always done. Drifting, using, surviving, day to day. The murders hadn't changed him, or if they had, it wasn't visible to anyone on the outside. People who knew him during this time described him the same way they had in 1989. Quiet, withdrawn, never aggressive. The kind of person who faded into the background of any room. But inside, White was carrying the weight of multiple killings. Whether that weight affected him psychologically, whether he felt remorse or simply rationalized his actions, we'll never fully know. What we do know is that he didn't stop. September 1995, a convenience store in Houston, late at night. The kind of small store where the clerk works alone, separated from customers by bulletproof glass and a cash slot. Behind that glass sat Pham, 22 years old, working the night shift to help pay for college. He'd immigrated to the United States with his family years earlier, seeking the American dream. Now, he was working toward it, one night shift at a time. September 23, 1995. Around 11:30 p.m., Garcia Glen White walked into that convenience store. Not to buy anything. Not to use the restroom. He came to rob it. Details of exactly what happened inside that store come from security camera footage, grainy, black and white, but clear enough, and from forensic evidence collected at the scene. White demanded money. Pham, separated by bulletproof glass, would have been safe if he'd simply given White the cash through the slot. But something went wrong. Maybe Pham resisted. Maybe he reached for an alarm. Maybe White panicked. We don't know the exact sequence. What we know is that White didn't leave with just money. He left that convenience store having taken another life. This time, though, things were different. This wasn't a murder in a private apartment where bodies could sit for days. This was a convenience store on a busy street with security cameras. When another customer found Pham's body around midnight, police were called immediately. The crime was fresh, evidence was everywhere, and most importantly, there was video. The footage showed a man entering the store at 11:28 p.m. The timestamp would prove crucial. The man was wearing a jacket and a baseball cap, but his face was partially visible. His height, build, and movements were all captured. Houston police threw resources at this case. A young man killed during his shift. A family devastated. A robbery murder with actual evidence, not just DNA and fingerprints at this time, but video footage. Officers familiar with the area started showing the footage around. Do you recognize this man? It took less than a week. Garcia Glen White was arrested on October 3, 1995, 10 days after Pham's murder. He was pulled over for a routine traffic stop, expired registration. When the officer ran his information, White's name came up flagged in connection with the convenience store murder investigation. He was brought in for questioning. And this is where everything changed. October 3, 1995. An interrogation room at Houston Police Headquarters. Garcia Glen White sitting across from two detectives. Initially, they wanted to talk about Pham, about the convenience store, about the security footage that placed White at the scene. White seemed calm, cooperative, almost relieved to be caught. Detectives started with standard questions. Where were you on September 23rd? Do you know this convenience store? Have you ever been inside? White answered directly. No lies, no dodging. Yes, he'd been there. Yes, he'd robbed the store. Yes, he'd killed Pham. But then something unexpected happened. As the interview stretched into hours, White's demeanor changed. He started talking about old mistakes, about things from years ago that still haunted him. When detectives pressed, White mentioned a name. Bonita. The lead detective, a veteran named James Mitchell, who'd worked hundreds of cases, felt his stomach drop. Bonita. That name was familiar. Very familiar. Bonita Edwards? Detective Mitchell asked carefully. White nodded. And her daughters. The interrogation room went quiet. Every detective knew the Edwards case. It had been unsolved for 6 years, a triple homicide with no suspects, one of those cases that eats at you, that you think about at night. And now sitting in front of them was the man responsible. But White didn't confess immediately. First, he tried to deflect. He claimed a friend named Terence Moore had been responsible. Said he'd only watched. Said he hadn't participated. Detectives left the room to check records. When they came back, they had devastating news for White's story. Terence Moore had died months before the Edwards murders ever took place. The alibi was impossible. Confronted with the timeline, White's demeanor shifted. The silence stretched. And then finally he said the words that would close a 6-year gap in the investigation. I did it. The confession came in waves. Hesitant at first, then increasingly detailed. White described the apartment layout, the argument, the knife, the positions of the victims, details that exactly matched crime scene analysis reports. He knew things only the killer could know. The placement of a broken lamp, the bathroom door, the bedroom, everything aligned with forensic documentation from 1989. But White wasn't done confessing. He told investigators about Greta Williams, another killing, another life taken. 3 confessions in one interview. Bonita, Annette, Bernette, Greta, and now Pham. 5 people dead, 5 families destroyed, 1 man responsible. When prosecutors later reviewed the recordings of this interview, they noted White's calm tone throughout. No panic, no breaking down, just quiet matter-of-fact descriptions of murders that had spanned 6 years. It was as if he'd been waiting to tell someone, waiting for this moment of confession, waiting to be caught. The Edwards case was immediately reopened. DNA samples from the original 1989 evidence were pulled from storage. New testing techniques, advances made during the 6 years the case had been cold, were now available. The FBI laboratory took over, advanced mitochondrial DNA analysis, more sophisticated matching techniques, better technology. The results came back definitive. Genetic match. Garcia Glen White's DNA was present at the Edwards crime scene. Between the confession, recorded, witnessed, documented, and the DNA evidence, prosecutors knew they had an unshakable case. Garcia Glen White would finally answer for what he'd done on November 30th, 1989. But first, he'd have to stand trial. And the details that would emerge in that courtroom would force everyone to confront the question, how does a human being do this? How does someone kill 5 people over 6 years and continue living as if nothing happened, don't click away? The trial that followed would reveal psychological evaluations, forensic evidence, and testimony so detailed that even veteran court observers would be shaken by what they heard. Summer 1996, 8 months after Garcia Glen White's arrest and confession. The Harris County Courthouse in Houston was packed. The trial of the decade was about to begin. Outside, television crews set up cameras, reporters jockeyed for position. Family members of the victims, Bonita's relatives, the Edwards extended family, Pham's parents, arrived early to secure seats in the gallery. Inside, Garcia Glen White sat at the defense table, 33 years old now. 7 years had passed since the Edwards murders. 7 years during which he'd walked free, killed again, and lived among the very people he'd victimized. The Harris County District Attorney's Office indicted White on 2 counts of capital murder. Specifically the deaths of Annette and Bernette Edwards, the 16-year-old twin girls. Why not all 5 victims? Strategy. Texas law allows prosecutors to seek the death penalty for multiple murders committed during the same criminal transaction. The Edwards twins case was strongest. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA was conclusive. Prosecutors could always charge the other murders later, but this trial was about securing a death sentence. July 15th, 1996. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Torres, stood before the jury. 12 citizens of Harris County who would decide whether Garcia Glen White lived or died. In November 1989, Torres began, 3 people were murdered in their own home. a mother and her 2 teenage daughters, killed by someone they knew, someone they'd trusted, someone who sat on their couch, ate their food, and then took their lives in the most brutal way imaginable. Torres laid out the evidence systematically: the timeline, the crime scene, the autopsy results, the DNA match. The defendant's own words, she said, holding up transcripts of White's confession, will convict him. His own DNA will convict him. The science, the evidence, and the truth will show you exactly who Garcia Glen White is, a killer who took 5 lives and felt nothing. Over the next 2 weeks, prosecutors built their case piece by piece. Crime scene reconstruction. Digital forensic experts presented 3D models of the apartment, showed jurors exactly where each victim was found, explained blood spatter patterns, demonstrated the sequence of events. Autopsy results. The medical examiner testified for 3 hours, detailed the injuries each victim sustained, explained the cause of death, showed photographs, graphic, disturbing, necessary. Several jurors looked away. One wiped tears. But they all understood the brutality of what had happened in that apartment. DNA evidence. FBI laboratory analysts testified about the mitochondrial DNA match, explained the science in terms jurors could understand, showed statistical probability. The chances of the DNA belonging to someone other than White were astronomical. This DNA match, the analyst testified, is as close to certainty as science can provide. The confession. Prosecutors played audio recordings of White's confession. 47 minutes of Garcia Glen White's voice, calm and steady, describing how he killed Bonita, Annette and Bernette Edwards, describing where he stabbed them, how they'd tried to get away, what he'd done afterward. The courtroom was silent, absolutely silent. Even court officers who'd heard thousands of cases stood frozen, listening. The knife. Forensic analysts testified about the murder weapon, showed microscopic analysis of the blade, demonstrated how unique wear patterns on the knife matched wounds documented in the autopsy. The level of detail was overwhelming. Every piece of evidence connected back to one person, Garcia Glen White. The defense, led by attorney Marcus Webb, faced an impossible task. The evidence was devastating. The confession was damning. DNA doesn't lie, so they didn't try to claim innocence. Instead, they argued context. Garcia Glen White is guilty, Webb told the jury in his opening statement. We're not disputing that. What we're asking you to consider is why. What drives a human being to do something like this? The defense presented psychiatric evaluations. 3 different mental health professionals had examined White. Their diagnoses: chronic substance-induced psychosis, sociopathic personality traits, diminished cognitive function due to long-term drug use. This is a man, Webb argued, whose brain was destroyed by crack cocaine, a man who couldn't distinguish right from wrong in the moment, a man who needs treatment, not execution. They showed brain scans, highlighted areas of damage, brought in experts to explain how addiction literally changes brain chemistry. The Garcia Glen White who killed those people, Webb said, wasn't in control of his actions. The drugs had taken over. He's not a monster, he's a victim of addiction. But the prosecution had anticipated this strategy. They brought in their own psychiatric experts, doctors who'd also evaluated White. Their conclusion? White knew exactly what he was doing. Substance abuse doesn't excuse murder, Torres argued. Millions of people struggle with addiction. They don't kill families. The defendant made choices. Every step of the way, he made choices. They pointed to the timeline. White had been using drugs for years before the Edwards murders. During those years, he hadn't killed anyone. Then, in 1989, he did. Why? Because he was angry, Torres said. Because he wanted drugs and didn't get them. Because Bonita Edwards said no and he couldn't accept that. Prosecutors then introduced evidence of White's other murders. Greta Williams, and Pham. This isn't substance-induced psychosis, Torres argued. This is a pattern. When things don't go his way, he kills. That's not mental illness, that's evil. The judge allowed this evidence because it showed intent, premeditation. a continuing threat to society. After 2 weeks of testimony, the trial moved to closing arguments. The defense made one final plea for mercy. Don't execute a man whose mind was destroyed by drugs. That's not justice. But the prosecution's closing was devastating. The defendant killed 3 people in their own home, Torres said, pointing at White. He killed them because he wanted drugs and they couldn't provide them. Then he walked out and continued living his life for 6 years. She paused, letting that sink in. 6 years during which he could have turned himself in. 6 years during which he could have shown remorse. Instead, he killed 2 more people. Torres held up photos of all 5 victims. Bonita Edwards, 38 years old, mother, daughter, sister. Annette Edwards, 16 years old, honor student, dreamed of college. Bernette Edwards, 16 years old, artist, wanted to be a teacher. Greta Williams, killed and nearly forgotten. Pham, 22 years old, working night shifts to pay for college, murdered for the cash in a register. July 18, 1996. After less than 1 day of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreman stood. We, the jury, find the defendant, Garcia Glen White, guilty of capital murder. In the gallery, Bonita Edwards' family wept. Relief mixed with grief. Justice, but not peace, because no verdict brings back the dead. Pham's parents held each other, silent tears streaming. Garcia Glen White showed no reaction. He simply stared forward, expressionless. But the trial wasn't over. Under Texas law, a separate penalty phase would determine whether White received life in prison or death by lethal injection. The question before the jury: does Garcia Glen White pose a continuing threat to society? The prosecution's answer was unequivocal. Yes, they presented White's complete criminal history. His confessions to multiple murders. The timeline showing escalating violence. He didn't stop after one family, Torres argued. He continued until he was caught. If you spare his life, if you send him to prison instead of death row, what's to stop him from killing again? Inmates, guards, other prisoners? They brought in experts on prison violence. Statistics showing that some killers remain dangerous even in maximum security. The only way to protect society, Torres concluded, is to ensure Garcia Glen White never has the opportunity to kill again. The defense returned to their core argument: mental illness, addiction, diminished capacity. Death is not appropriate here, Webb argued. This is a broken man, a man who needs to be locked away, yes, but execution? That's vengeance, not justice. They brought in White's family. His mother testified, crying, begging the jury to spare her son's life. He's sick, she said. He needs help. Please don't kill him. But the evidence was too strong, the pattern too clear. 5 victims across 6 years, no remorse during any of it. July 18th, 1996, evening. The jury returned with their punishment decision: death by lethal injection. The judge, reading from prepared remarks, addressed White directly. Mr. White, you have been found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. You took the lives of 5 innocent people. You showed no mercy. The state of Texas will show you none. As guards led Garcia Glen White out of the courtroom, he turned slightly. For just a moment he looked at the victims' families. No apology, no remorse, just a blank stare. And then he was gone. Transferred to the Pulaski unit in Livingston, Texas, death row, where he would spend the next 28 years waiting for the state to carry out his sentence. But those 28 years wouldn't be quiet. Appeals would be filed. Evidence would be challenged. The legal system would grind slowly toward an inevitable conclusion. Stay with us. Because the nearly 3 decades Garcia Glen White spent on death row would become their own saga. A story of legal battles, controversies, and the agonizing wait for justice that stretched across generations. July 1996. Garcia Glen White was transferred from Harris County Jail to the Pulaski unit in Livingston, Texas. Death row, the most secure facility in the state. a place designed for one purpose: to house inmates awaiting execution. White was 33 years old when he arrived. He would spend the next 28 years in a cell measuring 60 square feet. The Polunsky unit operates on a strict routine. Every day, exactly the same. 23 hours in your cell. 1 hour in a caged outdoor recreation yard. 3 meals passed through a slot in the door. No dining hall, no communal areas, no interaction except brief exchanges with guards through steel barriers. The cell contains a bed, a toilet, a sink, a metal desk. That's it. Guards who worked the unit during White's time there described him as quiet, compliant, withdrawn. He didn't cause problems, didn't seek attention, just existed in the mechanical rhythm of death row. For inmates on death row, time becomes strange. Days blur into weeks, weeks into months, years into decades. The world outside continues. Technology advances, society changes, presidents come and go. Inside, nothing changes. White received few visitors over the years, some family at first. His mother came monthly for the first few years until her health declined. After she died in 2003, visits became rare. Then non-existent. Letters from the outside world faded, eventually stopped entirely. For many death row inmates, the hardest part isn't the noise, it's the silence, the slow realization that the world has moved on without you, that you've become a ghost while still breathing. But while White sat in his cell, his case refused to die. 2000-2004. In the early 2000s, a scandal erupted that would rock the Texas criminal justice system. The Houston Police Department crime lab, the same lab that had processed DNA evidence from the Edwards murders, was found to have serious problems. Contaminated samples, improper testing procedures, potentially unreliable results. An investigation revealed errors in hundreds of cases, some dating back decades, including cases that had resulted in death sentences. Defense attorneys across Texas seized the opportunity. If the HPD crime lab was unreliable, how could any conviction based on their evidence be trusted? In 2004, White's attorneys filed a motion requesting that all biological evidence from the Edwards apartment be retested using modern forensic techniques. The towel, the blanket, the DNA swabs collected in 1989, everything. The court approved the motion. Modern DNA analysis in 2004 was light years ahead of 1989 technology. More precise, more reliable. Capable of extracting information from degraded samples. When the results came back, they showed something unexpected. A partial foreign DNA profile from an unidentified male. White's attorneys immediately argued this proved someone else had been in the apartment. A mystery person whose DNA was present but unidentified. This raises reasonable doubt, they argued in court filings. The state's case rests on the assumption that Garcia Glen White acted alone, but there's evidence of another person present. For a brief moment, a flicker, there was hope. Maybe the case wasn't as clear-cut as everyone thought. Maybe White hadn't acted alone. Maybe the evidence was compromised, but the prosecution demanded a full forensic audit, chain of custody reviews, expert analysis of the DNA results, independent verification. What they found: no indication of tampering, no evidence of contamination during initial collection. The foreign DNA was likely the result of degradation over 15 years of storage, or cross-contamination during retesting, or any number of innocent explanations. Most importantly, the DNA that definitively matched White remained unchanged, still conclusive, still damning. The FBI laboratory, brought in to verify the results, confirmed. Garcia Glen White's DNA was present at the crime scene. The match remained statistically certain. In 2005, after months of review, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied relief. The new DNA evidence does not outweigh the overwhelming evidence of guilt, the ruling stated. The defendant's confession, the autopsy results, the crime scene analysis, and the FBI-verified DNA match all point to one conclusion. Garcia Glen White murdered the Edwards family. The appeals continued, each one finding new angles, new arguments, new reasons the conviction should be overturned or the sentence reduced. The next wave of appeals focused on White's mental state. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in Atkins v. Virginia that executing individuals with intellectual disabilities violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. White's defense team argued he met this threshold. They submitted psychological evaluations describing borderline intellectual functioning, IQ tests showing below-average scores, evidence of cognitive impairment from decades of drug abuse. Garcia Glen White doesn't have the mental capacity to fully understand his actions or their consequences, his attorneys argued. Executing him would be unconstitutional. The prosecution brought in their own experts. Their evaluations told a different story. White understood his actions. He'd planned his crimes. He'd evaded capture for 6 years. He'd given a detailed confession showing clear memory and logical thinking. Substance abuse is not intellectual disability, prosecutors argued. The defendant made choices. He understood those choices. He simply didn't care about the consequences. The courts agreed. Motion denied. By 2013, a new controversy emerged. Texas's supply of execution drugs was becoming difficult to obtain. European pharmaceutical companies refused to sell drugs for executions. The state had to find alternative sources. Defense attorneys nationwide challenged the new drug protocols, argued the drugs might cause unnecessary suffering, claimed the state couldn't prove the compounds were safe or effective. In Texas alone, dozens of executions were delayed while courts reviewed the challenges. White's attorneys filed similar motions, argued that pentobarbital, the drug Texas planned to use, might be expired, improperly stored, or potentially cruel. January 27, 2015. Garcia Glen White was scheduled to be executed the following day. His attorneys filed an emergency appeal with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. The appeal centered on the DNA retesting controversy and the drug protocol concerns. At 11 p.m. on January 27th, less than 24 hours before the scheduled execution, the court granted a stay. For the first time in nearly 20 years, Garcia Glen White wasn't facing imminent death. The execution was postponed pending review of the DNA evidence and drug challenges. For months, legal experts debated the case. Would the DNA evidence be enough to overturn the conviction? Would the drug protocol be found unconstitutional? Media outlets revisited the case. Death row inmate gets last-minute reprieve. Families of the victims, who thought justice was finally arriving, had to wait longer. By late 2015, the review concluded. The DNA evidence, even with the foreign profile, wasn't enough to overturn decades of conclusive evidence. The drug protocol met constitutional standards. The stay was lifted. A new execution date would eventually be set, but it would take nearly another decade before all appeals were exhausted. The years stretched on. White aged behind bars. The young man of 33 became a middle-aged man in his 60s. More appeals, more motions, more delays. Each one finding some new procedural question, some new constitutional challenge, some new reason to postpone the inevitable. The victims' families aged too. Bonita Edwards' mother died in 2018, never seeing the execution carried out. Pham's parents grew elderly, their pain no less acute despite the decades. Finally, after 28 years of appeals, challenges, stays and reviews, the legal process reached its end, October 1, 2024. The United States Supreme Court denied Garcia Glen White's final appeal. The highest court in the nation refused to hear his case. There were no more appeals to file, no more courts to petition, no more stays to request. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice set a final execution date, October 29, 2024. After 28 years on death row, 10,220 days in a 60-square-foot cell, Garcia Glen White's time had finally run out. Stay with us, because the final day of Garcia Glen White's life would be documented minute by minute, and what happened in the execution chamber at Huntsville would close a case that had spanned 35 years, 5 victims, and countless shattered lives. October 29, 2024. Huntsville, Texas. The Walls Unit, a red brick prison that has witnessed more executions than any other facility in modern American history. At dawn, correctional officers entered Garcia Glen White's cell at the Pulaski Unit. The journey he'd been on for 28 years was ending today. "Mr. White," one officer said quietly, "it's time." White was 61 years old now. Nearly 3 decades had passed since his conviction. The world outside had changed dramatically. Inside, White had barely aged beyond the grey in his hair and the lines on his face. The drive from Pulaski to Walls takes about an hour. White was placed in the back of a prison transport vehicle. No handcuffs during the ride. At this point, what would be the point? Guards who made the trip later described White as calm, not defiant, not resigned, just still, like he'd already left his body and was simply waiting for it to catch up. 9:47 a.m. The transport arrived at Huntsville. The Walls Unit looms over downtown Huntsville like a monument to Texas's relationship with capital punishment. Since 1982, when Texas resumed executions, this facility has carried out over 570 death sentences. White was processed through intake one final time, identity confirmed. Fingerprints matched against records. A brief medical examination. Protocols require ensuring the inmate is healthy enough to be executed. A grim irony. Texas no longer grants special last meal requests. That privilege was eliminated years ago after one inmate requested an elaborate feast and then refused to eat it. Now, death row inmates receive the same meal as the general prison population. On October 29, 2024, lunch was chicken patties, mashed potatoes, green beans, white bread and iced tea. Prison records show White ate very little, maybe a few bites of the mashed potatoes. The rest sat untouched. White had requested a spiritual advisor weeks earlier, a local chaplain who volunteered with death row inmates. The man had visited White several times in the weeks leading up to the execution. They met one final time that afternoon. The conversation was private, but the chaplain later said White seemed at peace. He wasn't fighting it anymore, the chaplain told reporters. Whatever demons he'd been carrying for 35 years, he'd made some kind of peace with them. Inmates scheduled for execution are allowed final phone calls. White had no family left to call, no friends who'd stayed in touch, no attorney who needed last-minute instructions. He made no calls. By 5 p.m., witnesses began arriving at the Walls Unit. Texas law requires specific witnesses for every execution. Media representatives, 3 reporters selected by lottery from dozens who'd requested access state officials. Representatives from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the Attorney General's Office, victims' families, relatives of Bonita, Annette and Bernette Edwards. Hi Van Pham's parents. They gathered in a waiting room, knowing they'd soon be led to a small chamber with a large window overlooking the execution room. Reporters who witnessed the execution later described the atmosphere as heavy, quiet. Nobody spoke above a whisper. 6 p.m. The sun was setting outside. Garcia Glen White was moved to a holding cell adjacent to the execution chamber. He could see the gurney through a small window, the leather straps, the IV stands, the clinical, sterile setup of the room where he would die. Guards checked on him every 15 minutes, asked if he needed anything. Water. A moment alone. A chaplain. White declined everything. Just sat on the bench, staring at nothing. At 6:50 p.m., guards entered the holding cell. "Mr. White, it's time." He stood without resistance, walked the 30 feet from the holding cell to the execution chamber. His movements were slow but steady. Inside the chamber, medical technicians waited by the gurney. White climbed onto it without being asked, lay down, positioned his arms on the supports extending from either side. Medical technicians began their work. Leather straps secured White's arms, legs, and torso. Not tight enough to cause pain, but tight enough to prevent any movement. 2 IV lines were inserted, 1 in each arm, redundancy in case one fails. The lines would carry pentobarbital, a powerful sedative used in Texas executions since 2012. The warden, standing nearby, watched the process. He'd overseen dozens of executions. Each one followed the same protocol, the same mechanical procedure. At 7:05 p.m., the preparation was complete. A door opened in the witness chamber. The families, the officials, the media representatives filed in. They took seats on benches facing the large window overlooking the execution room. Through that window, they could see Garcia Glen White strapped to the gurney. His head turned slightly toward them. His eyes were open. The warden approached White's head. A microphone hung above the gurney, amplifying any final statement. "Mr. White," the warden said formally, "do you have any final words?" White turned his head toward the window, toward the victims' families watching from the other side. His voice was soft, but the microphone carried it clearly. "To the families," he began, "I'm sorry for all of it, for Bonita, for Annette and Bernette, for Pham, for every person I hurt." He paused, took a breath. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know I carried this weight every day. Every single day for 35 years. Another pause. My life was destroyed by drugs, but that's not an excuse. I made choices, terrible choices, and people died because of me." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm ready for this to end. I'm ready to finally answer for what I did." Then he began to sing, softly, a hymn. "I am going home, to be with the Lord." The words were faint, almost whispered, but every person in the witness chamber heard them. The warden stepped back, looked toward a one-way window where the execution team waited, invisible to witnesses. He gave a slight nod. The flow of pentobarbital began. The drug moves quickly through the IV lines, reaches the bloodstream within seconds. Pentobarbital is a barbiturate, a central nervous system depressant. In the doses used for executions, it causes unconsciousness within seconds, followed by respiratory failure. White's singing faded. His eyes closed. His chest rose once, twice, then stopped. The room fell silent. Witnesses stared through the window, some crying, some stone-faced, all processing what they'd just witnessed. A physician entered the execution chamber, checked for a pulse, for breathing, for any signs of life. There were none. At 7:22 p.m. on October 29, 2024, exactly 35 years after the Edwards murders, Garcia Glen White was pronounced dead. The witnesses were escorted from the chamber. Media representatives immediately rushed to file reports. Garcia Glen White executed for 1989 triple murder. The victims' families walked out in silence. Some hugged each other, others simply left, ready to finally move forward after 35 years. Outside the prison, a small group of anti-death penalty protesters held a vigil. They held signs, "Execution is not justice. Stop state-sponsored killing." Across the street, victims' rights advocates held their own vigil. Signs reading, "Justice for Bonita, Annette and Bernette. Remember the victims." Two sides of an endless debate, played out once again in the shadow of the walls unit. Inside the prison, Garcia Glen White's body was taken to a local funeral home. Per his request, he would be cremated. He'd left instructions that his ashes be scattered, though where, he never specified. No family came to claim his remains. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice released a brief statement. Garcia Glen White was executed by lethal injection at 7:22 p.m. on October 29, 2024, at the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas. He was pronounced dead 7 minutes after the drugs were administered. The execution was carried out according to Texas law and TDCJ protocols. No mention of the 35 years between crime and punishment. No mention of the 5 lives lost. Just bureaucratic language documenting the state's business. Outside the prison, reporters caught up with relatives of the Edwards family. "This doesn't bring them back," Bonita's sister said, tears streaming. "Nothing brings them back. But at least now, we know it's over. White can't hurt anyone else, that's something." Pham Pham's father spoke briefly. 35 years we waited. My son would be 57 now. He'd have grandchildren. A whole life, gone because of one man's choices. He paused, composing himself. I don't know if this is justice, but it's all the justice we're going to get. Stay with us for just a few more minutes, because the story of Garcia Glen White doesn't end with his execution. It ends with the questions his case leaves behind. Questions about justice, about the death penalty, about how we remember victims and how we handle those who destroy lives. October 30th, 2024. The day after Garcia Glen White's execution, newspapers across Texas carried the story. Convicted killer executed after 28 years on death row. Most articles were brief, a few paragraphs summarizing the crimes, the trial, the execution. Another entry in Texas's long history with capital punishment. But for those touched by White's crimes, the families, the investigators, the attorneys, the story is far more complicated. 35 years, that's how long the Edwards family waited for this moment. From November 1989 to October 2024, nearly 4 decades of pain, grief, and waiting. Bonita's sister, who attended the execution, spoke with reporters the next day. People ask if I feel better now, she said. If there's closure. But closure isn't real. My sister is still gone. Those girls never got to grow up, have families, live their lives. White's death doesn't change any of that. She paused, collecting her thoughts. What it does do is end the constant reminders. The appeals. The news stories every few years. The hope that maybe somehow he'd get out. That's over now, and that's something. Detective James Mitchell, who'd taken White's confession back in 1995, retired years ago. But he watched the news coverage of the execution from his home. I spent 29 years in law enforcement, he said in a phone interview. Worked hundreds of cases. But Garcia Glen White, that one stayed with me. Not because it was the most violent or the most shocking, but because of how ordinary he seemed. Mitchell explained what he meant. White didn't fit any profile. He wasn't a serial killer in the classic sense. He wasn't organized or methodical. He killed because of circumstances. Drugs, anger, opportunity, and that's what makes cases like this so hard to solve. There's no pattern to predict, no profile to follow, just bad decisions made by someone capable of terrible things. White's execution reignited familiar debates about capital punishment in Texas. Opponents pointed to the 28 years between sentence and execution. If justice delayed is justice denied, one activist said, then what is justice delayed for 3 decades? That's not closure for families, it's prolonged trauma. They also questioned the cost. Texas spent millions on appeals, legal proceedings, and incarceration, more than it would have cost to keep White in prison for life without parole. Supporters countered with the victims. 5 people dead, 5 families destroyed. The death penalty was appropriate here. The delays were caused by endless appeals, not by the justice system failing. But beyond the death penalty debate lies something more troubling. How many cases like this go unsolved? Garcia Glen White killed 5 people between 1989 and 1995. He was only caught because of the Pham murder, the one with security cameras and immediate police response. If not for that convenience store robbery, would White ever have been connected to the Edwards murders? The DNA match was made because he was arrested and his DNA was in the system. Without that arrest, the Edwards case might still be cold. How many other Garcia Glen Whites are out there? People who killed once or twice or more and simply never got caught because they were careful enough or lucky enough or because the evidence wasn't strong enough. It's a question that haunts law enforcement. One positive legacy of this case, it demonstrated how advances in forensic science can solve cold cases. In 1989, DNA testing was rudimentary. Partial profiles, limited databases, no way to match samples unless a suspect was already in custody. By 1995, when White was arrested, technology had improved. The FBI's CODIS database was expanding. Mitochondrial DNA analysis became available. Science caught up to justice. Today, familial DNA searches, genetic genealogy, and advanced forensic techniques are solving cases that went cold decades ago. The Edwards case proved that evidence should never be discarded. that cold cases can be solved, that justice, even delayed, is possible. In the end, this story isn't about Garcia Glen White, it's about the people he destroyed. Bonita Edwards, 38 years old, a mother trying to protect her daughters in an impossible situation. She deserved better than the life she was living. She deserved safety. She got neither. Annette and Bernette Edwards, 16 years old, twin girls who dreamed of escape, who wanted college, careers, families of their own. They never got the chance. Greta Williams, a name barely mentioned in the coverage, another victim whose story was lost in the larger narrative. Pham, 22 years old, an immigrant pursuing the American dream, working night shifts to pay for college. Killed for the few $100s in a register, 5 lives, 5 futures erased. Garcia Glen White's execution doesn't erase what he did. It doesn't bring back the dead or heal the trauma inflicted on families and communities. What it does is close a chapter. A long, painful chapter that began on November 30th, 1989 and ended on October 29th, 2024. For 35 years, Garcia Glen White's crimes defined the lives of everyone connected to them. Families who lost loved ones, investigators who worked the case, a justice system that slowly, methodically, built the case for his execution. Now it's over. White is gone. The case is closed. And all that remains are memories of people who should still be here, who deserve to live, who were taken too soon by a man whose choices destroyed not just their lives, but the lives of everyone who loved them. If this case affected you, if it made you think about justice, about victims, about the death penalty, about how we as a society handle the worst among us, leave a comment below. These conversations matter, and subscribe to this channel. Because true crime isn't just about the criminals. It's about the victims. It's about the families who survive. It's about the justice system trying to balance punishment with humanity. It's about remembering that behind every case file, every trial transcript, every execution, there are real people whose lives were forever changed by violence they never deserved. Thank you for watching this difficult story. Thank you for remembering Bonita, Annette, Bernette, Greta, and Pham. Their names deserve to be spoken. Their lives deserve to be remembered, not as victims of Garcia Glen White, but as people, individuals, human beings who mattered. Until next time, stay safe, and remember those we've lost. Bonita Edwards, 1951-1989, Annette Edwards, 1973-1989, Bernette Edwards, 1973-1989, Greta Williams, Pham, 1973-1995. Rest in peace.